Hello everyone, I'm Kevin Hagopian. I'm a faculty member here in the College of Communications in Media Studies, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's Robert M. Pockrass Memorial Lecture. Dr. Pockrass was a member of the Penn State journalism faculty from 1948 until 1977. His teaching specialties were radio news writing, public opinion, and popular culture, and he loved to travel. For these reasons, speakers from this lecture series are often notable experts in popular culture, public opinion, and international communication. Dr. Pockrass possibly was best known for his dedication to students, not only when they were enrolled here on campus, but after they left Penn State. For many years, in fact, he edited the school's alumni news, keeping in touch with hundreds of alumni. He once attributed his great ability to remember the names and faces of countless graduates to the fact that he had for years edited the alumni notes. But those close to him knew that it was really because he cared so much about students as human beings. The purpose of this lecture is to honor Dr. Pockrass's memory and his many contributions to the former School of Journalism, now part of our College of Communications. The lecture series was endowed through scores of gifts contributed in Dr. Pockrass's honor, the most significant of which have been made recently by Judith Hardies of Phoenix, a 1952 Penn State graduate with strong family ties to the institution. When Judith learned of the Pockrass lecture, she contacted us, saying how much she had admired Bob Pockrass's commitment to and talent for teaching. On behalf of the Pockrass Coordination Committee, myself, Joe Dumas, Michael Olavsky, Boaz DeVere, Matt McAllister, we'd also like to thank others for making the Pockrass lectureship possible, including Dean Murray Harden, Joella Martin, and Steve Samsel, all of the College of Communications, Anthony Olaronashola, our department head in Film Video Media Studies, and Cheryl McCallops of the University Libraries. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Haiyan Jia, a recent graduate of the College of Communications and currently a postdoctoral scholar in the College of Information Sciences and Technology here at Penn State, who in turn will introduce this year's Pockrass speaker. Haiyan?
Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today's Pockrass lecture, Dr. Eszter Hargitti. Dr. Hargitti is Delaney Family Professor in the Communication Studies Department and Faculty Associate of the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on the social and policy implications of information technologies and how information technologies may contribute or to alleviate social inequalities. In particular, she looks at how people's use skills influence their use of digital media in a variety of contexts, including information seeking, health, political participation, content sharing, and privacy management. Dr. Hargitti is the author of over 65 journal articles and book chapters. She has published in top-tier outlets including New Media and Society, Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media, and the Journal of Computer Media Communication. She is the author or co-author of 3 books, most recently, Research Confidential, Solutions to Problems Most Social Scientists Pretend They Never Happen, with University of Michigan Press. She's currently working on a book on managing online reputation. Her work has received many awards and have been widely cited. According to Google Scholar, with a stunning number of over 9,400 times. In 2010, she was named as the Outstanding Young Scholar by the National Communication Association. Today, she'll be talking about the topic of the World Wide Web, the role of skills, and how people use the internet. Please join me and welcome Dr. Eszter Hargitti.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here for this lectureship, so thanks very much to the committee for inviting me. I'm a sociologist by training, and my interests are primarily in questions of social inequality. When it comes to the internet, this is a topic that's often been known under the term digital divide. Some of you may have heard of this term. It's usually understood as the divide between the haves and have-nots. Basically, if you don't use technology, you're on the wrong side of the divide, and if you do, then you're on the right side of the divide. And there's this assumption that once you've gotten access to technology, which is pretty much everybody in this room, all's set and no more problems exist. However, I've challenged this for over a decade, this approach, arguing that mere connectivity does not actually equal efficient and effective uses of digital media. But that it's about much more than that, and that we should actually think of this issue as a spectrum and call it digital inequality rather than the digital divide, recognizing that, again, there's a spectrum of differences. So the big question I raise in my work is who benefits, or who is the most likely to benefit from using digital media? As a sociologist, sociological theories drive my work, and there are these two competing theories about inequality. One is social mobility, where the idea is that thanks to opportunities, people can actually improve their life chances, and regardless of what background they come from, can actually do better than their parents did, for example. And then there's this other approach called social reproduction, which argues that, in fact, your social status in society has a lot to do with where you end up later in life, and in fact, whatever position your parents are in are probably where you're going to end up later as well. And so the question I ask is whether digital media have a role to play in all this. Can people, in fact, improve their life chances thanks to how they use the internet? It's a very big question, and I'm not saying I'm going to answer it overall, but I will give all sorts of hints as to where this all may be going. So I thought I'd start with not quite giving away the conclusion, but giving away what may be the conclusion. So I'm going to suggest 3 possible outcomes that we could see when it comes to using digital media over time and how it might affect people's life chances. So I look at socioeconomic status, which is basically people's life chances, how they are, where they are, often translates to education, income, those are the kinds of things it's made up of. So let's assume that while using digital media, people from different backgrounds, so people from less privileged backgrounds and more privileged backgrounds, can benefit about at equal rates. So what the outcome would be then that over time, there's not much change, right? If you were in a less privileged position, you pretty much end up in a less privileged position compared to those who are more privileged, even if you're in a somewhat better position later. Another possible outcome is that internet use actually improves the life chances of those who are less privileged, and they are able to catch up with those who are more privileged. Things like using the internet for more efficient job search, or being savvy financially, or getting more education than people would be able to otherwise. Those are ways in which people might be able to improve their life chances thanks to the use of the internet. And so that might result in those from less privileged positions actually catching up with those who are higher up on the socioeconomic status ladder. But what might also happen is that those who are less privileged are actually benefiting at lower rate than those who are more privileged, which, as you can see, would then actually increase the gap between these types of people over time. And so this is the most unfortunate outcome, because what you have is inequalities among people increasing over time. Now you might notice that there's actually a bias to all of these graphs, actually. There's an inherent bias, which is that everything is going up. And in fact, that's already an assumption. But I thought, let's keep the story positive. It could actually be that some of those lines go down, and that could result in even more problematic situations. And in fact, so 15 years ago when I started studying skill, my main interest was, well, those who are really skilled in using the internet will really benefit from the internet, leaving other people behind. But over the last 15 years, things have changed enough that, in fact, all sorts of negative things can come from using the internet. Say if you're not very savvy about privacy issues, your online reputation could end up in all sorts of problems. You might lose your job, which has happened to some people. So in fact, that line could even go down, but I thought, again, let's keep it positive for now. Okay, so one more side note is my data, the data that I draw on today are survey data, and I'll justify the use of those data. But more and more people are using the so-called big data these days, and there's a lot of excitement about big data, so I wanted to address that briefly and say that my talk actually does speak to big data a little bit, but more in a critical way than anything else, and I'll justify why I'm critical of big data through the results that I present to you. Just to be clear, big data, which one way to interpret is log data, so data that are automatically collected about people's behavior through digital media, that can definitely have really positive innovations for research, for sure. So I don't mean to negate big data research per se, in all its incarnations. But I do want you to think about it critically when you use big data as to what those data might actually be telling us and what those data may be hiding. So more on that later. Okay, so I want to take a step back and just show you the overall framework that I work with when it comes to looking at people's internet uses and how skill fits in. So I start out with a user. As I showed you before, there's this whole concept of the digital divide, which looks at non-users versus users. And while there are still actually quite a few people, even in the United States, who do not use the internet at all, those are not the people I research. So I only study people who are internet users, but recognize that even among them there are many differences. And one of the things that I recognize, which to a sociologist is pretty obvious, but to people from different fields isn't necessarily, is that it's important to consider people's genders, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, different background characteristics when looking at what they do online. And it's also important to think about the fact that they're using the internet in a certain social context and in a certain technical context. So it might matter that you have lots of great technical access points to digital media versus not, or that you have friends who can help you out with understanding internet use. And then what I argue and have done so for over a decade is that all of these will in fact influence your level of internet skill or efficient, effective uses of the internet or digital media more generally. And then the question is, okay, so do different levels of skill then influence what people do online, both in terms of more information-seeking types of activities, but also when it comes to content creation. A lot of the excitement about quote-unquote Web 2.0 has been that people can actually contribute their own voices to online conversation, diversifying those conversations and whatnot. And so there's a lot of excitement about that, but what do we know about who's actually using these sites? And then the really big question ends up being, this is what I started with when presenting those theories of social inequality, is whether people's internet skills and what they do online actually then feed back into their life chances, anything from how well they do at school, to their job opportunities, to their health status, and other types of life chances. So I keep referring to skill, but what do I really mean by skill? I think of it very broadly to include lots of different ways of being able to use the internet. And these include, at a very basic level, awareness and understanding. Like, do you even know, does someone even know that something is possible online? Going through to being able to find information efficiently online, and then being able to evaluate the credibility of information. It's an increasingly important skill, in fact. But then also participation, from joining communities to putting your own content out there. And then increasingly important in the last few years have been privacy and security issues, which have really come to the fore in many contexts. So today I will mainly focus on talking about this awareness and understanding angle and also participation. I've published quite a bit on the other topics as well, but they won't fit into today's talk, although in Q&A I'm happy to address those as well. So to summarize, the questions I'm addressing today are whether people's skill differ, so just at that basic level. How widespread is online participation? So when we're excited about the fact that in theory anyone can edit Wikipedia, does that actually translate to anybody and everybody editing Wikipedia? And then how are these two linked? So how is your skill linked to whether you're participating? Is there a connection there? But before I go and get into the details of the data, I thought I'd answer this bigger question: why should we care about any of this? Why are you sitting here listening to me talk? Well, so it turns out internet uses really do affect people's lives in various ways increasingly, and there are all sorts of scandalous articles you can read, but they're actually increasingly common. I mean, there's a website that's dedicated just to following all the people who've gotten fired because of what they've done on Facebook, right? So, I mean, it's happening more and more. It's not necessarily in the thousands or tens or thousands, but, you know, if it's you, that's a big deal. Or your friend, or your parents. And then there are other ways in which people are turning to the internet that are not necessarily optimal. Like in the first example, WebMD may not be the first best resource when someone gets shot in the room. But that's what people are doing. So, and another health-related issue is lots of information, often misinformation circulating out there, and then you think, well, who looks at this, but this website that, for example, puts out information like that is liked by over 1 million people. So this is information that is in fact circulating and a lot of people see it. And then finally, the policy angle is that the government is actually, and as is the private sector, spending a lot of money on wiring our schools, which is a good thing, but is it enough? Right? So we're spending literally billions of dollars making sure that all schools are infrastructurally up to date in terms of high connectivity, but are we putting in sufficient resources to making sure that students actually know what to do online? And if we're not, then is it really helpful that every school has high connectivity? And so now I link this to this assumption that a lot of people seem to have. In fact, both young and old seem to have this assumption, which is that, well, we don't really need to teach students how to use the technology because, well, they grew up with technology, they already know everything about technology, which is actually completely wrong. And so I used to look at skills for people of all ages, but then eventually I decided to focus on young adults, partly because of all these assumptions, partly because of what I saw in my classrooms, and partly because of what I saw from the data. That in fact, just because you're young and you grew up with technology does not mean that you're universally savvy with technology. But that was more based on anecdotal evidence. I wanted to test it with scientific methods. Okay, so what do we know? Well, this is what people think we know. But is it really based on evidence that we have systematically? Well, so it turns out, yes, young adults have in fact been online for many years, and for the most part spend quite a bit of time online. I don't think that's shocking to you in the audience. But when it comes to engaging in lots of different online activities, that's not actually universally true. So some young adults and people of other ages do many things online, but many others do not. And when it comes to universal savvy, we just cannot say that everybody is universally savvy no matter their age. There's actually quite a bit of variation. So these are the things I'm going to show you in more detail with data, through data that I've collected. So if you want to study skill, what kind of data do you turn to? I've done quite a bit of work through in-person observations where we bring people into the lab and we ask them to look for different types of content, and we look at how they do locating content efficiently and then being able to assess the credibility of said content. And then from some of that work have developed survey instruments to study skill, which is a much more scalable approach. So I'm going to spend the next few slides telling you a little bit about the methods. For those of you who are not that familiar with survey research, and just so you understand what my data set is really about. So I've collected a lot of data, and the data that I'll be speaking to you about today at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Now, purple is not their color. I'm from Northwestern. Purple is our color. Sorry, I think you might actually know that. But, okay, not everyone in the room follows all sports. For those of you who are not familiar with Chicago geography, Northwestern's in Evanston and UIC is actually down just west of the Loop. It's about 20 miles apart. I've never been affiliated with UIC. I have no affiliation, so why would I study? Why would I do a study there? It's not for convenience, because, well, first of all, there are other schools I could have picked. Also, we collect data in person in the winter, which, as you know, in Chicago is pretty bad. There's the average temperatures from the year when we collected data first. Okay, so why would I put myself and my researchers through this? Well, it turns out that UIC is one of the most racially and ethnically diverse universities in the country, which is really helpful when you're interested in questions of social inequality like I am. And also about half of the students are first-generation college students, which is also interesting. Additionally, they actually have a course that's required of every first year to take, which we, for example, don't have at Northwestern. And they were kind enough to work with me to put out this survey in that class. It's actually 90 sections, so it sounds easier than it is, because it's 90 different classes that we went to. And it's a paper pencil survey. And again, it's not because I like to make our life harder. Obviously, it would be easier to just administer a survey online, but since we're interested in things like skill and privacy, I didn't want to collect data online, which would automatically bias towards people who have more time online, who are more skilled, whatnot. So that's why we did a paper pencil survey. It's quite a bit of work because that first year in 2009, we collected data from over 1,000 students. So that's a lot of paperwork. What's even worse, logistically, is that we then followed up twice in postal mail. So that's a whole lot more paper. But I wanted to keep the mode of data collection constant across the different waves in case that actually affects how people respond to a survey. And we had a pretty good response rate. So just to clarify, this is the same people that I've been surveying over the years. So it's very exciting and very rare. It's what's called a panel study. And I will also add that this fall, I'm actually doing one more wave of data collection on these same people. And if people have ideas for things I should ask these young adults, I'm eager to hear them. I'm really open to input. So today I'll mainly be focusing on looking at 2012 outcomes in terms of what people are doing online, but using 2009 data in the statistical analyses as predictors of those outcomes. So it's very exciting to be able to do that over time lagging of the data. So just one more point in terms of why I stand by the quality of the data set. Because you could say surveys, I mean, people say all sorts of things and they don't take it seriously. And it's true, some don't. So in the first year, in 2009, I had this question on the survey. And anyone who got this wrong, I just threw out their survey altogether. And then in 2012, I actually had I had this question and another attention verification question. And anyone who didn't get both of them right, even if they just skipped it, whatever, I pitched them. So I only have data from people who I'm quite certain took the survey seriously. And so in the first year, I lost 4.5% of the sample, and in 2012, I lost 3.5%. So it's not too bad. So that's why I stand by the quality of the data set. Okay, so who are these people? They're mostly in 2012, mostly 21 and 22 years old. And by 2012 is when they should have graduated if they were going to finish in 4 years. About 48% of them had actually graduated in 4 years, which is actually very close to the national average, which is 44%. So it's pretty, the sample is pretty representative in that sense regarding US national numbers. So most of them are that age range. This is their characteristics from 2009. Few more women than men. As I said, many of them are first-generation college students, and less than half of the sample is white, so quite diverse racially and ethnically. But I do want you to remember that this is still a very particular sample. So it's very helpful for some questions, but we don't want to generalize too much to national population, but I'll have some data to help with the story there. Okay, so just some very basic descriptives. So confirming that, in fact, these are digital natives in the sense that they have grown up with technology. So probably not surprising to many of you in this room, since you're close to age to these people. So they have had internet access for many years, and they use it regularly, and they even use email, even though many people think they don't. What's interesting, this is more anecdotal. So this is not anecdotal, this is from the survey. What's anecdotal is that in 2010, I paid them money, and in 2012, I paid them money for filling out the survey, and the email I sent people to verify their postal address for sending the gift certificate, we got responses to immediately. So I think it's clear that if there's a reason to respond to the email, people are still using email. Okay, so let's look at awareness and understanding. How much are people understanding different internet-related terms? So see, these are some terms I ask, and I ask people to rate their level of understanding on a 1 to 5 point scale. And so this is what we get, and already showing that not everybody understands everything, and there is a range though. But you might be thinking, well, maybe people just don't know BCC, that what it actually stands for, but maybe they understand the concept of BCC. So I also do I also ask some multiple choice questions. So here's one where I ask, do you understand what BCC is? What is BCC? And so feel free to read the 4 options. If you know what BCC is, this is not a trick question. You should be able to pick the right one pretty quickly. But if you don't, then you might not be able to. And in fact, in 2010, a third of the students could not figure out what BCC is, not identify the right answer. So again, this assumption that just because someone's young and grew up with technology does not mean that they know everything about technology. And BCC, I think, is an interesting example because there are lots of awkward situations that can result in school, but certainly also at the workplace when people don't know these functions very well or don't use them well. So some other terms that quickly fall down to pretty low understanding. In fact, RSS is one of those things that many years, many data sets, it always comes out as last. And what is it, last year that Google discontinued Google Reader, and I could have told them years before that like people don't know what feeds are and RSS is, and for years RSS was on every website. This has changed, it's not there anymore. Finally, web designers figured out, oh, no one knows what that is. Okay, so these data show that many people don't actually know what RSS is, and that's fine, that people don't need to know, but we don't want to assume that they know, and web designers don't want to assume either. Okay, how about phishing? It's another one of those examples that, well, maybe people are able to identify website addresses, they just don't know that it's called phishing. Okay, let's see. So I thought, well, let's ask people whether they can actually identify a correct URL. Well, that was the result. So here's a question, and I'll give you a moment to think about what the right answer might be. And for people who know how to read URLs, this is actually not a trick question at all. But for people who don't, it's not that easy. And it turns out many, many, many people get this wrong. So half of people thought it was this, which it is not, because that's a website that would be based in Russia, based on the .ru. And this is one that would be based in Venezuela, based on the .be. And this is one that actually, I don't remember what .nu is, but it's a pretty small country, I think somewhere in the Pacific. So that's not it either. So 12% of the people actually got this right. This is young adults who are supposed to be super savvy with technology and know everything about the web. Not necessarily the case. So I measured level of understanding skill through this 27-item instrument and get quite a bit of range and variation. I have several articles that document just the methods of coming up with this method. So if people have more interest in that, I'm happy to talk about that. So then the question is, as I said, okay, so we've pretty much, I've shown with the data that there's definitely variation in people's skills, right? So some people are understand the web very well and others don't. So can we identify systematic relationship of skill with background characteristics? That's the next question. So when it comes to gender, 2009 data, what we have is that women rate their level of understanding lower than men. And over time, this doesn't really change. So even though level of understanding does go up slightly on the whole, it goes up at about the same numbers, a little bit higher. It goes up a little more for women, but the difference by gender is still statistically significantly different. However, gender is a very complicated variable when it comes to internet skills. One of the things that I've shown in my research is that women rate their skills lower than men, even when their actual skills are pretty much the same. And this is very consistent in research generally on gender, that men tend to rate their skills higher than women regardless of actual skills. We don't know if it's women underestimating their skills or men overestimating their skills or possibly both. But so this is a complicated variable in question. But what's also important to note is that in another paper, I showed that even if you just think that your skills are lower, that actually does influence what you're doing online. So it thus matters. This XKCD comic, I don't know how many of you are familiar with XKCD, I highly recommend it. It's a great little geeky cartoon. So I think this cartoon sums it up really well, what may be going on, which is that we have stereotypes about women, that they're not good with technology, and so here you have a guy who does something bad with math, and his friend just says, well, you're bad at math. And then the woman who makes the same mistake, and then the friend says, oh, well, all women are bad at math. So it's a very different approach to the same exact behavior. And on that, a side note, highly recommend the book Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. It's a fantastic book on stereotype threat that I think everyone should read. And that kind of goes into this a lot. Okay, how about socioeconomic status and skill? So what I found, and here I'm measuring socioeconomic status by the level of education of the students in the sample. The level of their parents' education, sorry, that's important. So obviously every student is in the same class at UIC, so their education is the same level. But their parents' education level differs, and that's what I'm measuring here. And basically what I find is that people who come from less privileged backgrounds, i.e. whose parents have lower levels of education, themselves have lower level internet skills than those who come from more privileged backgrounds. So this is one of those cases where we wonder, okay, does this change over time? Does this gap close, for example? And so what I found fascinating was that while, again, everyone's skill went up a little bit over those years, the relationship to socioeconomic status remained completely consistent. So that's a discouraging result when it comes to the potential of the internet to alleviate socioeconomic differences. Okay, so I've talked to you about these bunch of young adults in Chicago, and we found differences for them. What might the picture look like if we had an even more diverse sample across the nation? It's kind of hard to answer that because we don't have too many data sets where we have information about people's skills. So that's why I've been focusing on the young adult sample. There was one data set that John Horrigan, then at the Federal Communications Commission, collected on nationally representative data across the US and found that both income and education are positively related to skill, not surprising based on everything else I told you. But interestingly, that data set also shows that if you look at people just under 50 and under, there's no relationship between age and skill. So not only is there quite a bit of variation among young adults when it comes to their skill, if we compare people, these people in their 20s to people in their 30s, 40s, there's actually no variation on the whole among them. So this stereotype that young adults are necessarily more savvy with technology doesn't hold up when it comes to the data. Okay, now moving on to joining communities. So these seem like really old data, and you might be thinking, well, what does this have to do with anything today? So I'll show you that in terms of patterns, again, the story is actually quite consistent over the years. So here we have some data from 2007, which is actually a study I did before the 2009 data, but this similar idea for sampling young adults at USC. And what I found was that in 2007, both when it came to Facebook and MySpace, people's socioeconomic status related to how likely they were to be using those services. And then people would tell me, oh, but this is going to change over time. This relationship is going to go away. The numbers changed, but the relationships didn't, right? So from 2007 to 2009, socioeconomic status still relates to who's adopting which site. Okay, but what do we care about MySpace today? Fine. Let's move on. Well, actually, one more point on that. So in 2007, the higher education press wrote up some of these findings, but I couldn't get the national media to write it up. The answer was, who cares about a bunch of Chicago young adults? Okay, well it turns out that 2 years later, Nielsen came out with some data that pretty much completely confirmed what I had found for the Chicago young adults. So in fact, that they found for nationally representative data that MySpace and Facebook were being adopted by socioeconomic status differently. Okay, moving on to social network sites of interest today. By socioeconomic status in the 2012 data set, looking at these websites, here's what I find. So other than Facebook, which has near universal adoption in this group, not completely universal, but near, all of the other websites, what you have is people who come from less privileged backgrounds are less likely to be on those sites. So this is where I want to take you back to that question about big data. Because the way big data studies work is they grab data from Facebook or from Twitter, and the only people in those data sets are people who use those sites. But what does it mean then that people who are from less privileged backgrounds are much less likely to be on those sites? It means that their voices are much less likely to be represented in those data sets. So that's why if you're working with data sets from those sites, just be conscious of the fact that you're already working with very much a biased sample. Okay, so how about nationally? So again, we have very little data where we can compare nationally. But Keith Hampton from Rutgers and the Pew Internet Project did collect some data nationally in 2013 where they do disaggregate by different social media. And here I look at education level of the person, the respondent, and find that in fact there too nationally we have difference in your level of education and how likely you are to use these different social network sites. And so again, depending on where you're grabbing your data, you're getting data about different types of people. So one limitation of the Pew data, as helpful as they are, is that they don't have data on skill, and they also don't have data over time about the same people. So going back to my data set, I can also look at skill level, how much your skill from 2009, does it influence whether you're adopting these social media years later? And it turns out it very much does, right? So your skill from years before influences what you're doing years later. And if you want to see the concurrent skill, the graph is very, very similar. But it's better when we have lagged data, because then your use of the site, if you're just looking at 2012 data for both variables, then it could be that you're using the site and that made you better skilled. But if I'm taking the skill data from 3 years before, when you weren't even using most of these sites, that's much more helpful in detecting that relationship. How about contributing to content? So I also asked on the survey whether people have done these different things and actually how often, which is voting on content, posting video, editing Wikipedia, things like that, posting reviews, and basically find that many people have only done 1 or 2 of these. Some people haven't ever done any of this. And there's quite a bit of variation who's active doing these things, and that's just ever. So even though I asked people how often, so few people do things more than once that it wasn't even worth looking at the data in that way. And again, find that there is some relationship between socioeconomic status and contributions, meaning that people who are from less privileged backgrounds are less likely to be putting their voice out there in different forms. And also, perhaps not surprisingly at this point, how skilled they are in 2009 influences very much what they're doing 3 years later when it comes to contributing content. So from years before, your skill very much relates to how much you're actually putting your voice out there. Now, some of you may have heard of the great gender divide in Wikipedia contributions. It basically, there's my attempt to show the ratio there. It's actually off. So men are much, much, much more likely to edit Wikipedia than women. Whether that's fixing a mistake or adding new content or or starting a new article. And so the question is, why is that what's going on? Well, in work that I've done with Aaron Shaw on this data set, we found that in fact, there's no gender difference when we look at people who are low skilled with respect to the internet use. So there's no difference between low skilled men and low skilled women in terms of contributions. They're just not very likely to contribute at all. What's curious is that once we go up the scale, on the skill scale, high-skilled men are very likely to contribute to Wikipedia, whereas high-skilled women are much less likely to do so. And we don't know what the answer is to that. We're working on new projects to try to figure that out, but it's a big puzzle. Nonetheless, it's important to have identified skill as partly what is explaining that gender difference. So I've talked to you about contributing content and joining communities. I've done other research and have published papers on health information seeking, job seeking, news consumption, other types of political participation, and have consistently found that skill is in fact positively related to all of these outcomes. So how skilled you are in using the internet is always positively related to whether you're participating politically online, how are you doing finding health content, etc. So that's, again, an argument for looking at skill and recognizing that it is, in fact, an important part of the puzzle. I want to take a step back from the skill argument per se and think more broadly about this issue of how people's socioeconomic status influences their skill, which influences what they do online. There are many different questions that people ask about how users what they do online and how that might influence other parts of their lives, right? So one of the big questions we have, especially comes up around election time, like right now, is whether internet use influences political participation. So that's a big question we have. Another big question people often struggle with is, how does gaming online influence academic achievement? Some people say gaming is great, it enhances all sorts of skills in students. Other people think it's students doomed to spend a lot of time gaming. Which one is it? Another possible question that comes up increasingly is how people's social media presence might influence their job chances, right? Is it a good thing to be online and promoting yourself, or are you going to run into trouble like those examples I showed? The message I'd like you to take away from this is that there's not actually a simple answer to any of these questions. As usually, it depends, which is a little frustrating, but research is often frustrating and complicated. Here's another way to put this. So some people think the internet is all good, right? Like play games, it'll help you go on social media, it'll help you get a job. Spend time on civic engagement online, it'll make you more politically active. That's the positive approach. And then we have the naysayers who think it's all bad because it's our doom and it's going to lead to bad grades and you're going to lose your job and all that unfortunate outcome. Okay. Well, it turns out that conveniently a smiling or frowny turned into a Venn diagram. And my argument is that the reality is somewhere in between, and that it depends on people's backgrounds and circumstances what the answer to those questions might be. So usually there's not going to be an answer that says, sure, playing video games online will improve your academic achievement. It actually depends. It depends on how skilled you are, what types of games you might be playing, in what context, and how you're using that for other things. So it might depend on your background, your parents' education, things like that. So that's the message I'd like you to take away from this talk. And of course, that skill very much matters. And so why is it helpful to focus on skill? Well, other factors that we've identified that matter, things like gender and socioeconomic status, there are things that we either don't want to change, like gender, or things that are not easy to change. Obviously, changing people's socioeconomic status is a much larger agenda and question and issue. But the potential to change people's internet skills, to improve people's internet skills, is something that we could potentially achieve through much lower scale interventions. So that's why it's a potentially fruitful area of research and also intervention. So to summarize the takeaways, people's skills definitely differ considerably, and these are often related to their background characteristics. And it's the more privileged who tend to be more skilled. In fact, data that I haven't shown you, but that Mary Ringo Morris and Anne-Marie Piper and I are analyzing now, look at seniors 65 and over. Actually, 65 to 80 are the people we have data on. And in that age range as well, socioeconomic status very much matters to your level of skill. So no matter the age of the group we're looking at, it seems like SES is very much an important variable. So unfortunately, from the evidence I've presented, looking at those three possible outcomes that I started with, it looks like it's the most discouraging version that seems to be playing out, given that it's the more privileged who tend to have more skills and who then tend to do more things online. So this is what things look like right now, and the hope is that if we can improve people's skills, then hopefully people from less privileged backgrounds can also benefit more from the internet, and then we wouldn't have this gap, larger gap developing. So I don't know if you guys remember, I guess for some of you that's quite a long time ago. Well, same year as for everyone, but a portion of your life a long time ago. So in 2006, Time named as its Person of the Year, you. But what I'd like you to take away from this talk is that that's actually too simplistic, because it's not really you, it's some of you, and it's really just the skilled among you who Time should have called the Person of the Year. So on that note, I'd just like to thank all the students who have helped me with the work and the funders of the project, and open up for questions. Thank you. I answered all your questions about skills. We're all good. All convinced. Yes? Arlene, yes.
From ISD. Can you talk a little bit about, now you mentioned just briefly your use of experimental methods or observations in a lab. done any skills analysis based on actual performance in the lab? Or is it always questionable?
Right, so the initial work, my dissertation work over a decade ago at this point, that was actual skills and then survey skills, but all the analyses there were about actual skills, and there too socioeconomic status, specifically measured in that case through income and education, mattered to effective and efficient searches. I have since collected related data. It turns out that part of the challenge of those in-person observations, other than that's incredibly labor intensive and expensive, is that I think it's increasingly hard to quantify those data to make such analyses possible. Because back in 2001, 2002, I think it was still legitimate to say how long you took was related to your efficiency, which was in fact one of my outcome measures. The other was, could you even find the answer? But I think today it's more complicated, because today, in fact, you might actually take longer if you're more skilled, because you might recognize the not credible information that you found. You might actually look at different sources and thus spend more time just to make sure you're getting the right answer. So the challenge I've had, which I mean I would love to do this, but the challenge of quantifying skill from the actual observation is a big one. And I don't have a good measure for what that would be. I'm absolutely open to ideas.
Yeah, I was just thinking about with the Wikipedia research, just even having people come in and say, just try it. And
Oh,
see what
right.
that could
Yeah,
be.
so I have not done it for Wikipedia or the contribution ones.
Yeah.
And again, frankly, partly I haven't because it's incredibly expensive and labor intensive, and you get at most 100 cases, and that's already a lot of work. But yeah, I think that could be very valuable, just to see what people are doing. We're trying now to have some multiple choice questions to identify Wikipedia specific skills, for example. It's working okay, but it turns out the general internet skill is actually more predictive of editing still. Oh, sorry, yes.
So in some of your data, so going back to the big question about whether the difference in skill levels leads to a widening of the gap sort of in digital inequality, which is your conclusion that it seems to be splitting apart more. In some of the data you showed, it seemed like they were both more or less increasing at the same rate, and I'm assuming in others they diverge, and maybe there's a few types of skills where they converge instead. So I'm wondering if you've given thought to, are there certain types of skills where we're more likely to see an increase in inequality, and other types of skills or benefits of the internet where maybe it is coming together?
Right, no, it's a very good question. So the graph you're referring to, their skill is like the outcome, because we're looking at whether socioeconomic status relates to skill. And then the question of whether that then influences other activities, skill sort of becomes the independent variable. So one area where we know that people from less privileged backgrounds are actually doing more online is the entertainment area and recreation. And then the big question there is, okay, so is that as beneficial for people's life outcomes as other types of activities? And there's I think a completely legitimate debate about whether it can be or not. And I think there are certain types of recreational activities that you could argue can be beneficial, right? It could be beneficial for mental health or that type of well-being. But generally, things like finance and political content and health, that's where the socioeconomic status is more the divergent type. So that's the issue. But there are definitely some things that less privileged people are in fact doing more. It's just not clear that the potential to benefit are equal. So, and again, I think it's a very legit debate as to whether it should count the same or not. Yes?
Yeah, I read your piece on college students researching photographic,
Yeah.
use of photographic permissions. And that made me think, I was thinking about that and what you've said here, and it sounds like there are some tasks that have this real kind of low saturation of interest, that it's like people are almost, are caused by some external reason to have to use the internet, and when they hit this level of where they feel like they've learned enough to satisfy some external measure, then they're done, and you showed how that results in a lot of misapprehensions in that specific area. And I just wondered if you're kind of following on Matt's question there, if you're finding any activities which draw people through the internet and train them to use skills in such a way that they're more likely to experiment on their own and to familiarize themselves with the possibilities that are out there. Are there, you know, it sounds like you're sort of skeptical about gaming?
Well, I didn't put out my personal
Okay.
position on that. I actually think gaming can in fact be helpful and beneficial. So I'm not on the side of saying that all recreational activities and gaming are negative per se. I don't think that's the case at all. Again, I think it depends on who's doing it, how are they skilled, what support are they getting. So I don't like to say it's just bad or just good. I think it definitely actually has potential. But regarding your question, so health is that domain where, if I'm understanding your question correctly, where people do really push harder, because that health questions have very real life consequences, right? So whether you can find the cheating, you know, what are those cheat sites called, right, to get to the next level, I mean, sure, that could be important in the moment, but you'll get over it. Whereas if you have a health concern, that's something you really, really want to know. So I have a separate paper. Well, again, it depends on how directly relevant it is, and partly this is hard to study in a lab environment because you can only hypothesize people to a serious situation so much, right? So we have a question where we ask, you know, what would you do if the condom broke and it was midnight, and you actually, it's not about the person because we never want to target so much, but your friend calls you frantically that the condom broke while she was with her boyfriend and it's midnight on a Friday night, and what do you do? And so some people get into that question a little bit more, thinking that their friend really does need help immediately. But so health, I mean, the literature suggested, and then we did a specific observational study just on health questions, and that is definitely an area where people are more serious. Now that doesn't mean that they don't find wrong answers. And so, and one of the things that we confirmed in that study was, well, confirmation bias is what we saw support for, that if you sort of you think you know the answer. So one of the questions we ask there is that you're out with a friend for dinner, a friend who's pregnant, and she's going to have a glass of wine, and should that be a concern? And so that's a question where most people actually think they know the answer, and we still ask them to search, and they do, and they very much go towards the answer they believe in. And so in the US, the general consensus is no, you shouldn't, but the UK has very different perceptions on that. And even in the US, there's debate and research that shows it's completely fine to have a glass of wine. So people who know of that research or believe that would navigate towards the links that would confirm that, and because that's one of those questions when you search for it online, if you just put in alcohol pregnancy, you get about half-half in terms of results. So that was very much about confirmation bias, that if what you know is there to be found, you will find it and you'll confirm what you find. But yeah, other health questions, I think that's an area. But again, people still get it wrong. For example, none of our respondents in that alcohol pregnancy study who ended up on a UK site mentioned ever that they're on a site from another country, and that might be the reason that they're different things. So it's sort of back to the people's ability to read URLs and be conscious of what the sources of their content. Yes?
Hi, thank you very much and for giving us the interesting presentation of so many interesting findings. Did you get a chance to see the generation gap between young people and their sort of parents in terms of like what you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So are you asking if I was able to collect data on these specific people's parents?
Right.
Yeah, unfortunately not. Not their skills. I do have some data, but I don't think this addresses what you're asking, on whether what types of rules people's parents had for them while they were growing up, which is actually an interesting question. And we also have questions about whether their parents supported their technology uses in high school. So would they work with them on things, pay them to help, things like that. And we've analyzed those data, and we have interesting findings there. Again, that's not about parent skills, so I can't address that. I know some other people have started collecting such data. But actually, I reviewed an article related, so I'll just be vague about it. But I think one tricky component of that is that if you're asking the students about their perceived skill of their parents' skill, that's going to run into the whole stereotype of parents being less skilled. So I think you need to do better than just asking the students about what they think their parents are, right? Yeah. So you basically would have to get data from both parties, which of course is a more complicated design. But yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I know some students have our end of our class, so if you guys need to leave, that's really fine. I won't take it personally. Yes?
That's a really interesting thought. I was just wondering if it seems to me like a lot of changes in technologies are kind of discouraging us from understanding how it works. It's kind of like, we do the work so you don't have to. And so it becomes less and less obvious how it's working, because the technologists think that we would prefer not to be troubled by that kind of thing. You know what I mean? So I'm wondering if you think that this sort of deficit is something that's just going to increase as time goes by.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right on. So the way I like to think about it, or as to why today's young people are actually, in many cases, less skilled than people in their 30s or 40s, is that they've started using the internet when what I call the prepackaged web, right? So those of us who went online when it was still like Yahoo putting in the directories, and you had to know what URL to go to, and even what's a URL, and like you have to actually understand some of how it worked. And that's in fact why I think these somewhat older people know the inner workings. Whereas if you came online in the age of the prepackaged web, where it's all shiny and it just tells you where to go and has all the links, then you don't need to figure that out. And so once you don't need to figure that out, then you don't, and then you don't know those tricks that you could actually use. So, right, if you know how to identify a web address and what the slashes mean, then if you run into an error page, you can actually backtrack and figure out where it might be the correct page. But if you just are always relying on the links, you wouldn't know how to do that. So yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. Yeah. That this whole what you see is what you get, like all that, not always helpful. Which, by the way, I would argue translates to other parts of digital and software as well, right? So a software stats program like SPSS that hides all the stats from you is not very helpful compared to the ones that actually make you program it and write out the lines, because then you actually have to understand what you're doing. So anyway, just no offense to those who use SPSS. But, yeah, which I used back in college.
They do, but I make them use the syntax.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, so that's basically, but it's so in SPSS, it's actually not that trivial to find the syntax. So it's really trying to obscure it for you. But yeah, I think that's definitely a good point. Yes?
I think it's very interesting to consider credibility assessment as a part of skills. So I'm wondering, how would you measure it as an indicator of people's skill? Would people be more critical about online content because it's more skilled, or just people who are more comfortable with online information would be considered as more skilled?
Right, so that's actually exactly the challenge that I was referring to when I was responding to Carlene, that I think back in 2002 there wasn't nearly as much misinformation, I would argue, so either you could find something or you just couldn't find it. Whereas today there's so much misinformation that you could be quick in finding something but find the wrong thing, and then you're not skilled. Or you could take a very long time because you decide, well, I'll need to check 3 different sources to make sure I'm actually finding the right thing, but then you're taking way longer, so that amount of time to completing the task is not a good measure. But then what's a good measure? The only measure then is that you found the right answer, but that's not a very helpful measure because if you give people unlimited amounts of time, eventually many will get there in a context where you're actually asking them to keep going. I mean, this gets us back to that question of how often do they actually, in their real everyday life, would they keep going or would they just give up? And that's very hard to emulate in a lab environment. So in fact, it's not necessarily always the best method. But studying something like, can you find the information you're seeking in, say, through an ethnographic method would be very difficult because, you know, how often is it going to be that someone is sitting down at the computer to search? That said, actually, my colleague Darren Gergel and I are starting a study, or well, we've been working on it for a bit now, on question asking in the larger environment of, we're not actually presupposing that you want to use the web, it's just how are you going to ask the question and from whom? And it's completely open-ended, so you can imagine what the data look like. Yes, complete disaster. But I think part of the challenge to this research as a next step is going past assuming that someone will do it online sitting in a computer. Because more and more they might do it on a phone, which then I would suspect they put less effort in again because it's less convenient. I mean, research has certainly shown that people still find using mobile much less convenient than when they get to sit at a laptop or a desktop. So yeah, but that is a big challenge there, I think, that it's not clear what the right measurement is for high skill. Do you have your anyone have suggestions for what kinds of questions we should include in the fall 2014? I'm open. I mean, we have a lot of them, but I'm eager to hear. Yeah?
Maybe like the difference, like